Hello there, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Stacia Cedillo, and I am a program specialist for EWA. Today's webinar, Coronavirus Stimulus, What Relief is Coming for K through 12 and Higher Ed. We are happy that everyone is here to join us. And before we start, I just want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the very unique circumstances of today's webinar. For context, the last EWA webinar that we had was on March 12th, and it was on covering the census. So it was very good, and everyone should go back and watch it. But March 12th, our last webinar, we were processing the news that the NBA was suspending its season. Some colleges and universities like Harvard and Michigan State were telling their students they had to leave campus and finish their semesters remotely. A handful of states, including Maryland, New Mexico, Oregon, announced that they were closing schools for a week or for a few weeks. And then March 12th was also the day that the World Health Organization declared that coronavirus was indeed a global pandemic. So in just the last 19 days since our last webinar, much has changed. 7 states currently have canceled completely K through 12 schooling for the remainder of the academic year. And most of us in journalism or in education are working from home. So on behalf of EWA, I want to first extend gratitude to our speakers for joining us today during what is an incredibly busy time for anyone who works in education or in education journalism. We are incredibly happy that you could be here with us today. And I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who is in the audience with us, working from home or from somewhere safe. Many of you with kids, many of you trying to navigate, as we all are, through this fire hose of what it seems like of information that is sprayed at us every day that we're all doing our best to take in. So with all that being said, I'll go ahead and jump in. Today, we are going to be discussing the recently signed Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, which was also known as the CARE Act, which was signed last Friday by President Trump. The CARES Act is set to deliver over $2 trillion in relief to individuals, small businesses, states, and local governments, corporations, and public health entities. Included in the relief package is over $30 billion in aid for K through 12 and higher education. So in this webinar, experts will outline how these funds break down into K through 12 and higher education buckets. And they will also explain some of the more bureaucratic provisions in the CARES Act, such as expanded ESSA waiver flexibility and what type of flexibilities have been granted to higher education institutions. So this format, our webinar format, is going to be slightly modified today. Instead of having one big conversation and then followed by a Q&A, we're going to split our discussion portion into 2. The first 15 minutes are going to be focused on the K through 12 side of the CARES Act, and the second 15 minutes we're going to discuss the higher ed side of the CARES Act. The last 25 to 30 minutes we are reserving for audience questions. So you'll have an opportunity to ask all 4 of our speakers, experts, and reporters questions from home. So let me now introduce our speakers. On the K through 12 side, we have Ann Hyslop and Andrew Ujefusa. Ann Hyslop is the Assistant Director for Policy Development and Government Relations at the Alliance for Excellent Education, a DC-based nonprofit policy and advocacy organization. In addition to prior roles with Chiefs for Change, Bellwether Education Partners, and New America, Ann served as Senior Policy Advisor in the U.S. Department of Education's Policy Office from 2015 to 2017, where she focused on writing regulations and guidance to implement the Every Student Succeeds Act. Andrew Ujefusa covers education policy and politics at Education Week, where he also writes the Politics K through 12 blog. He writes about Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos and national and state politics, and is also focused on Puerto Rico's educational system since Hurricane Maria. He previously worked at newspapers in Maryland and Mississippi, and he taught high school English in central Japan. Ann and Andrew will lead the first 15 minutes of our webinar conversation. And then the second 15 minutes, we'll turn to Terry Hartle and Carrie Murakami, who are going to lead us through what the CARES Act entails for higher ed. So Terry Hartle, who you cannot see on the screen, unfortunately, but he is with us by phone. Terry is the Senior Vice President for Government and Public Affairs at the American Council on Education, where he has spent over 20 years working with lawmakers on Capitol Hill on public policy that impacts colleges and universities. Prior to joining ACE in 1983, Terry spent 6 years as the Education Staff Director for the Senate Committee on Labor and Human Resources. And finally, we have Carrie Murakami, who covers federal higher ed policy in Congress and the Department of Ed for Inside Higher Ed. Carrie has also covered national healthcare, banking, and tech policy in DC, but has spent most of his career at newspapers covering the State House at the Seattle Times, City Hall at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, and breaking news at Newsday. So again, the final 25 to 30 minutes of the webinar is going to be dedicated to your questions. And so to everyone in the audience, to submit a question, type your question into the questions box, which is located at the bottom right of the GoToWebinar control panel. When you submit a question, please include your name and affiliation. And remember that you can ask it at any time, any point during the webinar. So with all that being said, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Andrew and Ann, who will lead us through the K through 12 provisions of the CARES Act, and I will pop back in when it's time to transition to higher ed. So go ahead and take it away, Andrew.
Great. Thanks, Stacia. And it's great to be here. Thanks to everyone who's on the webinar. Ann, I'm going to start off with a pretty general question, but maybe it can kickstart you. So I think overall it's fair to say that education is a pretty small part of the CARES Act. But, I think it'd be helpful to start out with, how much money is included in it for education, respectively for K-12 public schools, as well as for higher education and for a separate governor's fund. And specifically for K-12, what would you say the main purpose of the money is in terms of the coronavirus?
Yeah, that's definitely a great jumping off point, Andrew. And thanks again to EWA also for having me on. I'm excited to talk with all of you today. And before I just dive into the question, just since there's so much to cover, I want to mention that my organization has set up a website with all of our resources related to COVID-19. We primarily focus on K-12 education. That site is all@ed.org/coronavirus. So as Stacia mentioned, there's just over $30 billion in emergency funding out of the $2 trillion in the CARES Act. I think it's important context, though, that the initial draft of the CARES Act from Senator McConnell included no emergency funding for education. So we went from $0 to $31 billion in about the course of a week. That's less than House Democrats sought, less than many education advocates say will be needed to address the full scope of state and local needs long term, but it's more than what was originally offered. And that $31 billion is divided into three main funding streams. The smallest, which is about $3 billion or 10%, is arguably the most flexible. It's the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, and it provides money to governors to support the hardest hit school districts and IHEs in their state, as well as other education-related entities that could include early childhood education and childcare. And the amount that each governor receives will be based 60% on their relative share of the population between the ages of 5 and 24, and 40% on the state's relative share of Title I eligible children, so low-income K-12 age children. The largest funding stream out of the $31 billion is 46% of that, or about $14 billion, and that all goes to higher education, which Terry and Carrie, I think, will get into a little bit later on. And then the remainder of this is the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Fund. That is about $13 billion, or 44% of the fund. And these are funds that go directly to state education agencies and then in turn to school districts based on their relative share of Title I funding. So we're using the Title I formula to distribute the dollars. State education agencies won't be keeping most of this money. At least 90% has to go to school districts in their state. So most of the dollars out of this $13 billion pool are going to be spent locally. And districts can actually spend these funds on any allowable use under ESSA, under IDEA, under the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, under the McKinney-Vento program, which supports students experiencing homelessness. So it's quite a flexible funding stream, and there are a lot of different uses. But the CARES Act does kind of give a shout out to other uses of funds that are most tailored to the coronavirus crisis, like providing school meals, online learning, and special education services during these extended periods of school closures, coordinating with public health departments, purchasing technology and connectivity for students who are now transitioning to learning virtually, implementing summer learning programs, and actually just maintaining ongoing operations and staffing. There is not yet an application or timeline to apply for funds, but the Department of Education is going to develop one. And it's critical that one assurance that states will need to provide in order to receive these funds is a maintenance of effort requirement. So states are going to need to promise to maintain their state support for K-12 and higher education in fiscal years 2020 and 2021 at a level that is not less than the average that they've provided across the past 3 years. You might think that sounds kind of crazy given what's happening with the economy, so I will mention that Secretary DeVos can waive this requirement. Speaking of waivers, the CARES Act also addresses waivers from ESSA requirements that states and districts may need to manage through this crisis. It codifies the one-year pause of statewide testing, accountability, and related reporting that was already announced by Secretary DeVos a little over a week ago. Nearly every state has already applied for this flexibility even before the CARES Act was signed, but it's likely that all 50 states will be getting this flexibility soon. So it means no state tests this spring, very sparse school report cards this fall, and no new schools will be identified for improvement due to low performance next school year. However, states are going to be freezing in place their current list of struggling schools under ESSA and need to continue to provide support and interventions to those schools next year. So that's kind of the big waiver package for states, but it also creates an expedited 30-day process for districts to get waivers in a few key areas, most of which districts could already have asked for flexibility from, but this is just giving them a faster way to get that waiver. So they can apply to waive the provision that their Title IV Part A, which is called Student Support and Academic Enrichment grants, usually 20% of these funds need to be spent in very particular areas, like providing a well-rounded education. They can ask to waive that so that they can spend more funds on making effective use of technology. They can also ask to waive a provision that limits the amount of funds under this program that can be spent on purchasing devices. So that's going to be really important for districts that are transitioning to online learning. Districts can also apply for a waiver of maintenance of effort requirements at the local level, which is something they can't usually apply for. So that is one thing that is new under this bill. Typically, MOE requirements are not allowed to be waived. I think it's also important to note on the waiver front that Secretary DeVos is going to be providing a report back to Congress in 30 days about whether additional flexibility is needed, additional waiver areas, and that includes IDEA. And typically, there is no waiver authority under IDEA. It's very limited, so that's something to watch for moving forward. That was a lot, so I'm going to pause and let Andrew ask me a few questions. See what else is confusing. So, Andrew, back to you.
No, that was all great information. It was a lot, but a lot of good information. Just to clarify for folks, most of you already know this probably, but IDEA stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education. That's the federal law governing students with disabilities and schools' obligations to them. So, as you can imagine, it's a very complicated area of policy, and over the next 30 days, a lot of folks are going to be watching whether Betsy DeVos recommends additional flexibility for schools from that law. There are very strong feelings on both sides about whether she should, and if so, what the flexibility should be. Just to ask two more questions in this sort of segment. One about the money. What are you going to be watching for in terms of, how districts spend this money? As you mentioned, there's going to be a lot of flexibility, but do you think there are particularly smart ways for districts to spend the money? What should reporters be looking for in terms of how districts are meeting their needs in this essentially unprecedented circumstance?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is that I hope that there will be some public transparency around how the money is spent. I mean, I think it's just worth saying we don't even know how much money each district is going to receive. That's going to depend on whether the state decides to keep 10% of the funds for itself or maybe distribute 95% of the funds. So the first thing is just really following up, after the funds are actually expended to states about how much money did my district receive. And then I think there are questions about, well, are we spending this money sort of in the short term on sort of emergent needs around providing school meals, around, transitioning to online learning, buying devices, purchasing connectivity, that sort of thing, or even just like paying staff? Or is some of this actually being kind of saved for down the road for longer term needs, about thinking, we know that it's likely that there's going to be huge learning losses as a result of this time. I don't know how many parents are also in the audience. I think you're probably finding a new appreciation for the work that teachers do in having to sort of homeschool your children. And so thinking about whether we want to save some of this money for down the road, to think about, well, once school, it's safe for kids to be back in school, what extra supports can we be providing? And also thinking about our state budgets, our local budgets might be taking a hit if we rely on sales tax predominantly to fund education. So we might just want to, squirrel away some of the money to help ensure that we're not going to be facing a hit down the road. So I think that's a question I think I would ask districts, is how they're thinking about this fund in terms of sort of short-term needs versus longer-term needs.
And just quickly, to squeeze in one more question on the waiver side, a lot of reporters are used to writing about, here's what the school's grades were for my district for the last school year, things of that nature. How is that going to be different? What's going to be the biggest challenge in terms of finding out, what waivers districts, different states and different schools got, or just, what should reporters be looking for there? Just lots of gaps in information because that's the circumstance, or other things?
Yeah, so the Department of Education is required to post on its website all the waivers that have been granted. I'm sure there will be a lag in terms of when that gets posted, and it should at least be possible to figure out which districts and states have gotten which flexibilities. And then, yes, I think next year, when it comes to sort of that fall time and you're used to getting the state report card and the school report card that maybe has 8th through F grades for schools and has all the testing data, that simply won't exist. And so I think it's going to be sort of a whole new world of information. It's possible that some states may try and actually assess students in the fall when they come back to school. That's something to keep in mind. States typically have these big assessment contracts. They've already paid for these assessments. And so I think that that's something potentially to ask your state is, are you going to try and kind of assess students when school resumes to see where they are, and then try and use that data to address the gaps that you're seeing if students in particular, we might see more students needing to repeat a grade, or at least have some kind of plan to make up the time that was lost.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you, Ann and Andrew. And I know we could probably talk about this for hours. So thank you for being so concise and with that breakdown. And for everyone in the audience who didn't see, I did post a resource that Ann sent that breaks down everything she just went over. So now we're going to turn to Carrie Murakami and Terry Hartle to go over the $14 billion apportionment to higher education in the CARES Act.
Yeah, thanks very much, and hey, Terry. So I thought before we dive into like the details of the bill, maybe you can give us an overview of the situation out there. Like the colleges and universities ask for $50 billion, which sounds like a lot of money. But what are you hearing from the college presidents like around the country?
Well, thanks for the question, Carrie, and thanks to EWA for putting this on and inviting me to be part of it. We're talking to college university presidents every day, and I think all institutions are facing a slightly different set of circumstances depending upon their student population, the needs of their population, and the size of the institution that you're dealing with. I think if there's a common element, it is that every college in the country is facing an immediate cash flow crisis. University budgets are set. They're not terribly flexible. When revenue does not come in, when new expenses like refunds get added unexpectedly, they play havoc with the budgets. So as we talk to institutions, I think there are sort of three levels of concern. The first is the immediate term, the short term, the cost of closing an institution, cleaning cost, security cost, the cost of moving your educational instruction online. Some of the institutions are having to buy large numbers of laptops to give to students who otherwise don't have them. Related to that, refunds. Colleges and universities are looking at making a lot of refunds to students. Residential institutions are refunding room and board charges, and some institutions are refunding tuition charges because students are deciding not to continue their education rather than to move it online. So just in the last couple of days, a couple of schools I've heard from, the University of Wisconsin has 12 campuses. They have refunded or will refund $80 million in room and board charges. McDaniel College, a relatively small college nearby in Maryland, is going to refund $4 million from a $60 million budget. Penn State University is going to refund $42 million. TCU in Fort Worth, Texas, according to the Dallas Business Journal, will refund $29 million just for room and board. So institutions have to come up with that money, and it was not in their budget. Obviously, cost of moving online can be short-term costs, as I mentioned. And you're also seeing in the very short term the loss of revenue associated with hotels, conference centers, student unions, bookstores, and the like. So institutions are paying out money they didn't expect to in the short term, and they're losing revenue. Medium term, looking a few months down the road, the big question for colleges and universities is summer revenue and summer programs. For many institutions, particularly public institutions, summer is a period in which campuses are used for summer camps and summer programs and different meetings, adult education type activities. That creates havoc if you're losing a lot of revenue in that area. Typically, expenses are lower because large parts of the campus are closed over the summer, but revenue comes in. What happens if that revenue goes away? Similarly, over the medium term, loss of auxiliary revenue. Colleges and universities have lots of revenue sources that people don't think very much about. Last week, I had a conversation with a public university president in a major metropolitan area who mentioned in passing that she was losing $4 million a month in auxiliary revenue that came in for parking. And it sounds a little trite. On the other hand, $4 million a month, if you're running even a medium-sized university, is quite a bit of money. Similarly, the NCAA just announced that institutions of higher education would get about $450 million less this year than they were expecting because of the cancellation of March Madness. Longer term issues for colleges and universities, how soon can they reopen? We're really at the point where I think schools are starting to say, we might not make it back for summer, certainly not for the first half of summer. That's a hit. pretty soon people are going to ask, can we reopen safely in the fall? We're not there yet, but that will be coming. And then I think the big question for college universities is who will come back to campus in the fall? Usually campuses are able to predict very accurately the percentage of students who will return, and they usually have a pretty good idea about the percentage of newly admitted students who will enroll. Sometimes they're a little low, sometimes they're a little high, but generally they have a pretty good idea. The pandemic is unlike anything we've ever seen, and it's hard to imagine whether or not everybody is going to come back as if nothing had happened. It's quite possible some families will say to sons and daughters that you need to take a gap year because our resources just won't permit you to go to college in light of the big hit we've just taken in our income. Some students might decide they want to be closer to home, particularly if the long-term path of the pandemic is unclear. So I think the big issue that's out there is what will enrollment look like in fall 2020, because that's the next time colleges and universities will see a big infusion of revenue. And if schools have large numbers of students who don't come back, their revenue projections will be way off. It will create havoc with their budgets, and havoc with their budget means havoc for employees, because the biggest expenditure in most college and university budgets happens to be faculty and staff salaries.
Hey, fantastic, Terry. Thanks. Hopefully that gives reporters some ideas for questions to ask and stories to do. So, the ask was for $50 billion, and they appropriated $14 billion for higher ed. Can you go through that? I mean, I think it's not like all 14 goes to like universities to use however they want, right? I mean, there's certain restrictions, and there's also like other funds out there for research and other parts of the budget that might be relevant for institutions.
Sure. Let me start with the total amount of funding that the bill provides for education. The amount of money in the bill will be helpful, but frankly, it was a disappointment. It was considerably below the amount that colleges and universities asked for, just as it was considerably below the amount that elementary secondary education asked for. Education in the U.S. is a roughly $1 trillion industry. It represents about 5% of the GDP. 5% of this $2.4 trillion bill would have been about $120 billion. Instead, Congress put $30 billion, $31 billion technically, into education. I think this particular bill was designed to accomplish a couple of things. It was obviously intended to put a lot of money into the healthcare system to try and shore it up. Democrats in the Senate referred to it as a Marshall Plan for healthcare. Second, it was designed to provide money for individuals who suddenly find themselves out of work. I'm sure you all saw the last week unemployment numbers went up by 3 million. There are now conversations in Washington that the number of Americans out of work by the end of April could be as high as 40 million. So it was designed to prop up working families. Third thing it was designed to do was to bail out some industries and to do it in a way that was transparent and open. And those were sort of the big thrusts, I think, of that bill. Education simply was a second-tier priority at best. We are hoping, and I know the elementary secondary community is hoping, that as Congress turns to a fourth supplemental bill, they will be thinking more about education and the enormous financial hit that elementary, secondary schools, and colleges and universities have taken as a result of the virus.
Yeah, which leads me to my next question. I mean, there's talk about a fourth stimulus. Nancy Pelosi was talking about wanting to focus on infrastructure, but then you're hearing some opposition from Republicans on even doing a fourth package. I mean, what do you think is going to happen? And how well positioned you think higher education is or education is for getting some of the money?
I think it's far too soon to tell what's going to happen. Frankly, both parties are politically saying the things you would expect them to say at the present time. There was a great deal of discontent among House Democrats that they were essentially asked to accept the Senate product without any chance to put their own stamp on it. So the Democrats in the Senate, Democrats in the House, feel that if there is another supplemental, they should be the ones taking the lead in putting it together. And so that's why you're seeing Speaker Pelosi say the sort of things she's saying. Republicans quite naturally would say, let's see what's happened to this money that we have already spent. In fact, I think that the course of the pandemic and the extent of the economic dislocation that we're just now starting to see will determine the speed with which a fourth bill emerges. Congress has adjourned for a couple of weeks, so I think you'll see Democrats in the House start pulling together ideas for a fourth supplemental. I believe education will be part of a fourth supplemental. Exactly what those ideas will look like, it's a little hard to tell. You know, one of the questions Democrats will have to ask themselves, both with the elementary secondary part of the stimulus package and the higher education part, is are we going to use the same mechanism for distributing the money, or are we going to do some sort of a new mechanism? With respect to higher education, most of the money will go out through a formula that doesn't exist. The Department of Education will have to create it, and that will slow them down. It will take a fair amount of time. We are deeply worried that the money won't go out to institutions, best case scenario, for a month. Worst case scenario, it could be several months. So they'll have to review where they've been and whether or not they want to start again with something. I think another thing that will come up, particularly among the Democrats, is whether or not they want to make a major statement in a fourth supplemental with respect to student loan forgiveness. Some of the Democrats have proposed $10,000 in student loan forgiveness for every borrower. That would cost about $430 billion. It's a very expensive undertaking. Noticed the other day that Vice President Biden, the likely Democratic presidential nominee, has endorsed that idea. So it's quite possible that when we go into the next round, the Democrats will want to do considerably more on debt forgiveness than was done in the bill that has just been signed into law. So short answer, Carrie, too soon to tell. I think education will be a higher priority this time. That is a central part of America's infrastructure. Elementary, secondary schools, and post-secondary institutions run on money. They cannot go indefinitely without having money. And I think the risk you run is that the capacity that is there, the institutions that are there, will simply disappear if we don't provide resources to help them through this very difficult period. Just in the last couple of days, Central Washington University has declared a financial emergency. That's usually a step schools take when they are getting ready to lay off tenured faculty members. And Notre Dame de Nemours in California has announced that it will close. The Art Institute of San Francisco has announced that it will close after 150 years. They survived the San Francisco fire. They survived World War I, the pandemic, the Depression, World War II, but they didn't make it more than about a month in the COVID-19 pandemic. And I fear that we'll see more stories just like those three I just mentioned very quickly if Congress doesn't recognize institutional needs for revenue to help keep the doors open.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Terry. This is Stacia. We're going to go ahead and start the Q&A portion. The first question I have is on the K through 12 side. Howard Bloom from the LA Times asks, how soon is this funding likely to reach school districts, and how likely is there to be a gap between when district money runs out and the federal aid arrives?
That's a very good question. I think it is going to take a little time, a few weeks. I think, Anne, maybe it's going to be, well, maybe you have an idea as to specifically how long it might take for districts to actually get the money, but it is going to take a little time, I think.
Yeah, I think that there will definitely, it's not going to be available right away. The first thing that the U.S. Department of Education needs to do is develop a notice inviting applications, an NIA, for state education agencies, for governors as well, to apply for that governor's stream, because districts could get money from both the governor's pot of funds I referenced, the $3 billion, as well as from the $13 billion for K-12. Usually that is a pretty long process at the U.S. Department of Education. I think they're going to try to expedite this as quickly as possible since it's an emergency. But I think, once it even gets to the states, then the states need to disperse it to the districts. So I think we're looking at least 30 to 60 days would be my guess. And hopefully, it will be fast enough to get districts the money they need before they really run into cash flow issues. I think the districts that are going to face the cash, sort of the biggest hits earliest, are probably those that are relying in part on, as I mentioned, sales taxes, which are going to be affected first before, property taxes and other forms. So it kind of depends on where your district is getting most of its funding from. So from then sort of thinking when that the revenues might really start to be affected.
Let's take a higher ed question. Larry Gordon from EdSource asks, are the funds for higher ed divided by state, by population? Is it automatic or by application?
There are 3 buckets of money for higher education. Anne mentioned that the overall education stabilization fund is worth about $31 billion. About $14 billion of that will go to higher education. Of that $14 billion, 90%, or $12.5 billion, will be distributed directly to institutions by the Department of Education. The distributions will be based on the number of Pell Grant students enrolled and the number of non-Pell Grant students enrolled. The department will be prioritizing the number of Pell Grant students as Congress requested. The money will be sent to the schools once the Department of Education figures out a formula. For reasons that are unclear to us, Congress decided to have the Department of Education develop a new formula that does not exist. It is a formula that will require the department to combine a couple of different databases. The databases show different numbers for the same thing. In 2017, 2018, the last year for which numbers are available, one of the databases shows that there were 7.2 million Pell Grant recipients in the country. The other database for the same year shows that there were 6.2 million Pell Grant recipients. So the Department of Education has to figure out how to square that circle, and that money will go directly to institutions when the department can figure out how to send it out by formula. Doesn't go through the states, it'll be a check to the school. 1/2 of the money that goes to the school will be for the school's use. The other half of the money will be emergency grants for students. So if a student has a healthcare problem, if a student doesn't have enough food, if a student needs help getting home, that money will be for emergency grants to students. So one of the things that will delay getting this money out in addition to the formula is the level of guidance the Department of Education feels compelled to give institutions about how to spend the money. I mentioned that that's 90% of the total. 7.5% of the money will go out in a formula direct to what are called minority serving institutions. That's about $1 billion. And 2.5% of the money will be kept in a fund by the Department of Education for institutions that, quote, were hit hardest by COVID-19. Institutions at some point in the future will submit an application to the department to get funds under this very small pot of money, $330 million. Unfortunately, these are the schools with the biggest needs. Because of the way this money is going to be distributed through a grant competition, it'll probably be next year before any schools see any of the money. So that's a quick summary of the higher ed portions of the bill.
Mm-hmm. Great. Going back to K through 12 and the topic of IDEA flexibility, Kyle Stokes at Southern California Public Radio asks, what sorts of requirements might be waived? Is it a given that the education secretary will waive the requirements, or will the controversial nature of this topic cause her to shy away from touching IDEA?
I'll just say something quickly. I think it's too early to confidently predict what she'll do. I think we need to take into account, what happened at DeVos's confirmation hearing in 2017 and how special education came up in a way that, as far as many special education advocates were concerned, was alarming. I'll put it that way. But, there is another side to the issue where districts are saying, some flexibility would be appropriate. But there is going to be a lot of pressure on her from both sides. But I think it's too early to say she will or she won't grant that. And I don't know if you think there are areas where if you're going to grant flexibility, it might make more sense compared to others, but I'd be curious as to that as well, actually.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. It's a little too soon to predict what the secretary may do in this area. Certainly, congressional Democrats, as well as like the civil rights advocacy community, is really opposed to this idea. So I think there are definitely political considerations here about that would need to be taken into account. And I think one of the challenging things too is that the sort of impetus for this conversation in a lot of ways came from that original draft of the Senate bill, which gave the secretary broad waiver authority under the Every Student Succeeds Act as well as IDEA. So it wasn't even just talking about specific provisions, it was literally anything could be waived. And so I think this conversation hasn't even gotten to, well, are there particular IDEA provisions that are a problem? It's really been talking about sort of all or nothing. And I think that that's where the conversation, I think districts need to speak if there's a particular provision that's problematic, getting a little bit more nuanced about where the problems are, and then thinking about, well, is this something that is more appropriate to be addressed via guidance? The department has already issued multiple rounds of guidance around educating students with disabilities during the coronavirus crisis. Or is this something where regulatory action is needed? I think, frankly, the conversation hasn't been nuanced enough or specific enough at this point. And IDEA is a complicated law, and I would be the first to admit I'm not an expert in it. But I sort of hope that that's where the conversation goes, so that we can sort of not be talking in these broad strokes.
Well, and I would just add that, I've looked at this issue a little bit, and special education advocates have told me, look, we don't want people and school leaders to act like they're walking around in some clunky suit of armor with respect to IDEA. There's flexibility, some of those folks say, within the law that maybe schools don't know about or aren't used to taking advantage of in terms of how services are delivered for students with individualized education plans, for example. So that's going to be interesting to watch too, how and if districts sort of look more closely at the law and say, well, now that we look at it, maybe there's a way that we can deliver services within the context of the current law. But yeah, waivers from IDEA are still going to be controversial at the end of the day.
I agree. A lot of this could probably be handled through guidance and better sort of just using the bully pulpit to make it really clear what is okay under current law.
Mm-hmm. we'll certainly be keeping an eye on that. Let's jump back to higher ed. We have a question from Michael Zunstein, who's a freelance reporter, and he asked, is there any money in CARES for basic needs? And more broadly, are there any restrictions on how to spend the $14 billion for higher ed? So 2 questions there. Is there basic needs funding in CARES, and are there any restrictions? What cannot be spent with that $14 billion?
Well, the money, as I mentioned, that schools will get will be divided into 2 pots, 50% for the institution and 50% for emergency grants to students. There, in truth, is the language is pretty open in terms of what the money can be spent for. That is, it doesn't have a lot of restrictions or definition. So one of the questions is, will the Department of Education decide to provide the definition? In terms of basic needs, I assume the question is about the basic needs of students for food, healthcare, shelter, and so on. The money for that, yes, is very much in the bill. That is the one half of the bill that institutions will allocate to individual students for emergency needs. So if that's what the questioner means by basic needs, that's pretty well covered. Again, one of the things we don't know is the extent to which the Department of Education will say, our biggest goal is to get this money out to institutions that are experiencing a cash flow crisis right now, versus the department saying, we need to dot every I and cross every T, and we won't send any money out until we have fully assured ourselves that we've put guidelines and regulations in place to do that. We hope if they err, that they will err on the side of getting the money out quickly. But it's very hard to get anybody from the Department of Education on the phone or on email these days. The agency is largely shuttered. So we are about to send a letter to the secretary asking the secretary to do everything she can to expedite the distribution of money to institutions, because that is the best thing she can do for us to help students as well as to help campuses.
I'll also add, we didn't talk about this at all, but just I think on the K-12 side of things that there is even more money than the $13 billion that's provided to school districts is money going into the SNAP program or food stamps. And previous, sort of in the second stimulus package, there was non-emergency funding for K-12 education, and in the bill that was prior to CARES, money to make it easier for students who qualify for free and reduced price lunch to get access to SNAP benefits. So I think that is also sort of addressing the basic needs of students, just making sure that kids aren't going hungry. So there's additional money for SNAP as well as for the child nutrition programs in the bill that's on top of this $31 billion we've been talking about.
Well, and I would just add quickly, even beyond that, there's $3.5 billion for child care and development block grants. Child care is obviously an adjacent issue to this, but also faces similar issues. And there's also an additional $750 million for Head Start, those early learning programs. So the potential benefits for young learners, for young children from this bill, and the money in it, we could also see, that as well as adjacent outcomes.
Mm-hmm. So one question I'm going to pose to all 4 panelists is from Diane Schaffhauer, and I'm not sure Diane's institution, but she has a good question, is were there any specific expenditures that you were surprised CARES Act does not cover? So let's start with you, Anne.
Yeah, so one thing that I was surprised, maybe isn't the right word, but disappointed, is that particularly given the fact that most students are transitioning to online learning, there was not a specific pool of funds for internet connectivity. So typically the E-rate program is sort of the largest K-12 program for providing internet connectivity to schools. It's run out of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, and there is arguably could be flexibility to allow the E-rate program, which is typically about connecting schools, to actually be allowed to give upgrades to home internet access for students. A lot of organizations have been are advocating for this, and it was not included in the CARES Act, but could be something to look for in future stimulus packages. So that's one area that I wish had been addressed and hope will be addressed in future packages.
This is Terry. I'll echo what Ann said. I was a little surprised. We had been told very directly by some of the congressional officials who were most involved in this that they were very interested in providing money for technology assistance for all of education. We had indicated that we thought a fund for technology assistance to help institutions and students who suddenly needed to transition to online learning would be included. It was not. The bill does provide significant flexibility to institutions to use money for technology purposes, but there wasn't a dedicated fund. One thing I was a little surprised by was that the provisions in the bill providing temporary relief for student loan borrowers were essentially the proposal that the House Republicans initially made when they floated their bill for consideration. Given how much the Democrats were talking about doing more in the area of student loan relief, I was a little surprised that this issue didn't show up a little better funded in the initiative. I think they'll come back to it in round 4, but I was a little surprised to see that they didn't do more of it in this bill.
Yeah, one thing I was surprised with in terms of that was the the relief that the borrowers got, like a 6-month suspension on making payments and things being interest free. It excluded like older loans, like Perkins loans and family loans. And I think I've heard a lot of complaints from advocates, questioning why those things were left out.
I think that's a very good point. If I could just add on to that very quickly, Carrie. We were surprised at that too. It is very possible that that was a drafting error. Congress was putting this together very, very quickly. Congress does not do well when they try to write legislation for which there isn't a precedent, and they don't have the opportunity to share it with people to get things figured out. So that could have been a drafting error that we will see them correct in subsequent bills.
I'll just quickly say, I'll underscore Ann's point about the remote learning piece. One other thing that I won't frame this in terms of a surprise since it is in there, but there was $100 million for Project Serve grants. This is a fund that helps schools recover from everything from natural disasters to violent community events. Parkland, for example, school district there got Project Serve funding after the shooting there in 2018. And I wonder if, given how much trauma and sort of the emotional toll that this could take on some students and educators, depending on where they are in the country, in a future round of coronavirus aid, that there might be more funding along those lines. Again, depending how bad things get and which particular areas and schools of the country are hardest hit.
Great. So we only have a few minutes left, and I have one last question for everyone. What are 1 or 2 quick story ideas for education reporters who are covering the CARES Act either right now, 6 months from now, or even a year from now? For all of our education reporters tuned in, can you offer 1 or 2 ideas for them to explore?
sorry, Andrew. I mean, I guess you know, as a former State House reporter, like one thing we didn't get to today, but I'm curious about is the funding picture at the state level. I think states are hurting, and Terry, you might want to jump into this as well. But there's like a provision in the bill that there's a discretionary fund that goes to governors who can decide whether to use it for K-12 or for higher ed. But you know, there's a provision, there's a requirement as part of that the states maintain 3 years of funding, like what they spent the last 3 years, and the idea is to like encourage states to not cut back on education spending. But there's a waiver that they can request of the secretary, and you know, I think some of the associations representing colleges and universities have to question whether that's strong enough.
I would just say, along Carrie's, match Carrie's point, follow the money cliche, both, you know, in terms of the how governors decide to use it and also how districts decide to use it. And on the accountability side for schools, you know, I just wonder how school districts and schools talk about the freeze that's likely coming from most schools, and also just whether this unplanned massive pause, disruption to accountability makes schools rethink how they talk about the issue and how they, you know, handle accountability generally in terms of school grades, strategies to improve schools. Those things could be, again, severely disrupted in the near future. I'm just wondering how districts talk about it and handle it.
I totally agree with Carrie and Andrew. Those I think are great ideas. The other thing I think that this is more of a long-term story, but just really diving into from the child's perspective, you know, how this is going to affect our most vulnerable children who, you know, this is hard enough if you are a child at home who has a parent that is helping you navigate this online learning environment. I cannot imagine for students experiencing homelessness, students who may not have a parent at home, students who have English learning challenges, special education students. So really getting at what are the learning losses that are coming as a result of the shutdown of schools, and how are districts addressing that? You know, how are we even measuring the learning loss that has accumulated, and then what the response to that is?
So real quick, Terry, what's your story idea?
I think every college and university is facing a short-term problem and a great deal of medium and long-term uncertainty, but the sorts of cash flow problems and uncertainties they're facing differs considerably from institution to institution. So I think case studies or individual stories in which you look at an individual institution in a little depth to see how they're responding for something that nobody could ever possibly have been prepared for would make for a very interesting reading.
Great. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining. I'm so sorry that I was having technical difficulties. Thank you to our guests, and for everyone else, please fill out the survey. We will have this recording up on our website very soon, along with the resources from Anne at Alliance for Excellent Education and from ACE. ACE has sent over their summary of the higher ed side of things. So thank you, everyone. All right. Bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.